Welcome back to Media7. About 1 in 5 New Zealanders are disabled. That is, they have one or more impairments that make it difficult to do some things: moving around, hearing, learning or socialising. You wouldn't necessarily know that from the media. But before we discuss that, we went and asked disabled comedian Philip Paxton if he had a few thoughts on the issue.
Media handles disability really badly. I say that I use a thing called the 3 T's, tragedy, trauma and triumph. It's using words like suffering and inflicted. I think visually the media reinforces and creates stereotypes. So I've been interviewed and people say, oh, can you sit in a wheelchair so that people, know that you're disabled? Or could we get a shot of you, struggling to pick up your cell phone or something, because it creates this amazing, emotive image of disability being such a terrible / odd / freakish thing. It's great that the show exists. I would say that to start with. However, it's kind of sanitised. So you've got these sporty, good-looking people that, from the waist up, don't even look disabled. Everyone speaks well, everyone sits pretty straight, that sort of thing. So I think it presents a very clean-cut image of disability that resonates with the non-disabled viewing audience. Probably some very basic rules around language and imaging that could begin to be introduced.
Philip Paxton there. Joining us now to further unravel disability in the media are Curtis Palmer, Associate Producer of the disability TV show Attitude, which has been shunted around to 3 different time slots in TV1's Sunday morning schedule this year, Waitakere City disability strategist Sasha Dillon, and award-winning journalist Sally Wenley. Welcome to you all. Curtis, let's start with what Philip said in that piece there. I presume it's not a new argument to you, the complaint about Attitude being presented by good-looking fit people who, in his words, don't look disabled from the waist up. Is that a difficult balance to get when you're making the show?
It's actually the first time I've heard that, and my response to it is that the people that we employ as presenters and reporters are, first and foremost, they do a good job. They're intellectual. They interact with our talent really well with empathy, and I don't think the way we look really comes into it. Yeah.
Is there any kind of tension there between someone like yourself who is an athlete, you're still an athlete, who got the injury and you are disabled, and between the idea of people who have lived with a disability all their lives, and the way that you present the show? Because, I mean, what his point was, it presents disability for a mainstream non-disabled audience.
We may front the show, but we get the people that we interview to tell their own stories. And so, yeah, I don't think that really matters too much, in my opinion. I think that the positive images that we portray override who's actually presenting the show.
And I have to say, you came and did a program on my family. My 2 kids have Asperger's syndrome, and I was impressed with the degree to which I was immediately able to trust you to talk to them alone. And it struck me there was a great deal of personal skill in the people who did the story. Is that a really key thing for the show?
It is a key thing, and like Philip said, it does come down to language. All of our directors are instructed on the do's and don'ts of how to talk to somebody with a disability and how that story should be told. I honestly agree that language is the way forward in lots of ways because, like Phil said, words like suffering and confined to a wheelchair, wheelchair bound, all those sorts of things are quite negative. There needs to be some sort of hope for disabled people, and I think changing the language definitely helps that. When we present our stories, disability isn't mentioned at the head of the story. We talk about what that person is achieving first and foremost, and you know, what they're doing, and we bring disability into it later on. And so I think that's a better way of doing it. And not only that, by not using words like suffering, it takes away that negative stereotype. You know, people with disabilities, I've been told, have high rates of depression. And that also comes from the negative stereotypes that the media has towards disability. And so by changing the language around that to a more positive way of saying it, I think it's good.
Sasha Dillon, I've read the draft strategy report that you've done for Waitakere City. I thought one of the more interesting points in that was that disability is not only about the nature of the individual concerned, it's about the nature of the environment that they're obliged to make their way in. I don't think that's very well understood or conveyed in the media. Do you agree?
I would. To be fair, I mean, the media are just members of the public like everybody else in the sense that we don't get taught about disability at school. The Like Minds Like Mine advertising campaign's done a lot to improve the way people think about mental health. We haven't seen a similar government-funded mass media awareness campaign for disability yet, and that's the kind of building blocks that will be needed to make that change. I would like to see disability picked up in journalism training. I think that's a reasonably obvious way of getting it in there.
So if you're going to do a broader communications campaign like the mental health one, do you talk about diversity or difference, or how do you do that?
Disability is not just about the way a person functions, it's about the way the world does. And too often the story is focused so tightly in on the person that you don't see any of the stuff around them. It's not like if you were doing a thing about poverty, you wouldn't just focus on the poor person, you might look at the economy, you might look at the global banking system or something like that. You wouldn't tend to just focus your story on the individual person and somehow hold them responsible for the situation.
Well, it's the same thing if you're doing a story about race, you wouldn't say you've got race, would you?
Yeah. I mean,
you'd look at the context so much.
The equivalent would be, and it's an issue that there is no consistent language. We're still evolving that. New Zealand's actually leading the world in some of the language stakes on the world stage. We just haven't quite caught up with some of the practice to match it. A lot of disabled people will still say things like people with disabilities. That came out of the 80s and 90s, and there were perfectly good reasons for saying it then. It is very similar, though, to saying people with race when you're talking about racism.
Can we stop saying differently abled now? Because that always sounds odd to me too.
Challenged is a good one too, but I think it doesn't matter so much what you say if you're dealing one-on-one, it's what you do that counts. Most people are pretty generous. If an organisation or a person is behaving okay, they'll let that kind of stuff slide. But I think the media do have an extra responsibility, because the message reaches so many people at once, to pay some attention to how that's conveyed. And it's not just the words, it's the way the story's set up. It's the focus of the story, it's the choice of angles. And it is time we stopped just seeing disabled people on TV who are either climbing Mount Everest or begging you for money.
Sally, you broke your back at the age of 16 and then had to make your career choices. You chose journalism. Was that the choice you would have made anyway? I
think it probably was. I've always been interested in people and learning things and travelling and getting out and about, so the fact that I ended up in a wheelchair after a bus crash was pretty irrelevant, and I've just always been a journalist. I went varsity and drank beer and threw eggs at the education minister and worked for the student magazine and all that sort of thing, and then went to broadcasting school in Christchurch, and it's great fun. I've worked in TV and print and radio. And I think there is listening to, especially yourself, Sasha, I think there's no need to get too PC and too over the top, because that, I think, as a journalist, I've never worked in the disability sector as such, I've always been a mainstream journalist.
Why is that?
I think, but I'll just finish my sentence. I think the point there is that
you've done radio, haven't you?
If you make it too PC and too difficult, the media will shy away from the story because they don't want to offend. If it's a lighter story, they will shy away from doing it. So I think we need to focus on that as well, and not sort of scare journalists off thinking, oh, I don't want to upset somebody or do something wrong. What was your question?
I can't remember that. I know you principally as a radio reporter. Was radio attractive because it made the fact of your disability go away and people just had to focus on what you were doing?
No, I love radio because it's instant and it's hourly news, and going out like to court, to trials, and out to health board meetings or out to floods. You're there, you're doing things, and it's just instant, exciting news, and that's why I love it.
Now, I've remembered my question too. Why have you always been in mainstream journalism? Was that a choice? Have you ever had a hankering to do specific disability shows or anything like that?
I never really thought about working for a disabled program as such. Is that the wrong thing to say? Disabled program, that sounds bad, doesn't it? Because when I started my career a while ago, I watched one program, I think it was the one before your producers took over, and it was shocking. I just thought it was really patronising and patting disabled people on the head, and I just didn't like it. So I thought, well, why should I, just because I've got a broken back, work for a program like that? It would frustrate me too much. It's moved ahead in leaps and bounds. And I have actually, as you asked, tried to put forward a proposal to TVNZ. I started off there as a student and did an internship and worked in the newsroom for a few years. And then I moved on to print and changed to radio. But I put forward through a proposal through South Pacific Pictures, which is a very well-known production company. And I had an idea for a doco, and I'll tell you what it is. It was to go from one end of the country to the other, and I would only be allowed to use public transport or hitch or all sorts of things, and I'd go to odd places and meet great people. I wasn't allowed to fly, and wasn't allowed to take my own vehicle. And the production company got right behind it, and TVNZ turned around and looked at our proposal and said, oh no, all our charter funding goes to the disabled program. And I said, well, this is a mainstream general interest program, and they still wouldn't have a bar of it. Oh no, all our funding goes to the Attitude program, and it is a disabled program. And I thought...
But yeah, I can see how that would, I mean, with your personality, I can see how that would have worked. But there would also have been political elements in that, because what, say, a bus pulls up and you can't get on it? Well, was that part of the idea of the program?
Yeah, that's it. I've travelled the world and have the most fun and meet the greatest people. I always get lifted up and put on buses, and even with radio, I went over to cover the floods over in the Coromandel one year, and I had to stop my car, and there was just a huge flood across the road, and then the firemen came, and I said, look, I'm a reporter for National Radio, can I come with you? So they lifted me up, and next thing I'm on the back of a truck, and they're lifting me up on the stock banks, and I'm doing live crosses from there, and it doesn't really make any difference to me.
Curtis, how do you find that? You go out and do stories in the field. Is the bigger barrier physical obstacles, because you're in the chair, or do you strike an obstacle that's really about someone's attitude very often?
Yeah, definitely the physical side of things. I think your personality can overcome any sort of mental barriers people have towards you. But like what Sally said, I mean, there's always a way around doing things. There's always people on hand to help you if you get into a bind as well. But we've had quite a few of our proposals knocked back by TVNZ as well, so don't feel alone in that.
And that wasn't the first one.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and, look, I think the biggest handicap, if we can say that, is attitudes and people's perceptions. Even with politicians, like for example, Rodney Hyde, it wasn't this election, the one before, and I had to go to Parnell to interview him about something, and I hadn't dealt with him before, and I went in to interview him. Oh, he said, I never know what to say to you people. And I'm sort of got the RNZ microphone, and I'm saying, and I said, what? and I didn't know what he was talking about. I thought he was speaking about journalists. And he said, oh, you disabled people. I said, I'm an effing journalist. What's the big deal? And then he said, oh, how did you get here? And I said, on a bicycle. And so his press secretary came and did the big sort of cover over. And another funny incident, I've done a lot of High Court reporting, and some of the judges, they'll come in, and I'm behind the media bench, and it's the court registrar will say, all rise, or stand, and His Honour's coming in. And I must say, sometimes I sort of wheel under a bit more, and so I get the glare, and the registrar will say, well, Sally can't stand up. And then in one case, the judge saw me on one side of the room with my notepad and all the journalists over the other side, and he said, oh, could you please move over the other side? And I couldn't get past all the lawyers. And I said, oh, well, Your Honour, it would take a bit of divine intervention because I actually can't walk, and you'd have to move all your desks. So he was horrified and adjourned the whole court, and got a special desk put in for me. And then following that, every time I went into court, the registrars would start coming up to me and say, oh, Sally, we need to just know your full name and your organisation. And I got a bit of a bee in my bonnet and said, well, look, just because I'm disabled. And they said, no, Sally. And they laughed and they said, you're embarrassing the judges because they keep putting their foot in it. So they need to tell the judges before, now Sally is here, so don't start glaring at her or tell her off for not standing up.
Right, now Sasha, we've beaten up on judges, politicians and the media. Is there anyone who is getting it right? In particular, are there journalists who report these stories well in the mainstream media?
I would rate Chris Barton in the New Zealand Herald very highly. Chris is wonderful to deal with when he's researching a story. He puts a lot of time into it, and he doesn't lose that individual personal flavour, but he manages to weave in the bigger picture as well. And it's so valuable when you're dealing with complex reasons why problems happen, to have someone who can do that.
He did the Jonathan Eadie story, didn't he? The young autistic man whose family is trying to get him back. That was an extraordinary political story.
Yes. And Chris was also instrumental in the Focus 2000 situation that led to the Select Committee inquiry into disability services, which has got major cross-parliamentary support going. And I think when a journalist can do such a good job and see a result like that out at the end of it, his employer should be very proud of Chris.
And speaking of politics, I was actually a bit interested. I see the Minister of Disability Issues has handed her, Paula Bennett's handed her portfolio down to Tariana Turia, who is a minister outside cabinet, and I think, well, that sort of doesn't give much credibility to disability issues. And then I thought, well, look at Ruth Dyson, a Labour who was the former minister, and she was DIC'd, and a lot of people end up with spinal injuries through people who've been drink driving. And I just think, well, I feel it's been put in the back seat, and I think politicians don't give it enough respect, and I think that also encourages the media to not give it enough time and respect as well. What do you think of that?
I don't know. I think it will be very interesting having Tariana Turia as a minister. She will bring a Māori flavour to that, and I think that's also an opportunity for New Zealand. When we talk about disability, we tend to be talking from a Pākehā worldview, and there are Māori worldviews that are a totally different way of approaching it. And there's some real value in that I would love to see the media getting into. Marae did a very good story about a circus troupe in Dargaville called Circus Kumarani, who do really good inclusive circus performing where they've got a mixture of disabled and non-disabled performers. And the way Marae handled it was totally different. Disability doesn't have to be the main focus of the story. It was about, a particular young Māori man and his experience of being in that performing circle.
Now, we just about have to finish, but Curtis, just one last thing. Last year you launched the Attitude Awards out of the show, which I thought was an extraordinary evening. Is it on again this year?
Definitely on again this year. We thought that this is something that we didn't have to do. Nobody asked us to do it, and we thought that all the hard work and fantastic achievements that people with disabilities achieve are going unnoticed, especially within the media. So we put on a bit of a shindig, and was a rousing success, and we were going to be having it again.
Well, best of luck, and I will see you there. Thank you to Curtis Palmer, Sasha Dillon and Sally Wenley, and we'll take a break now and turn the airwaves blue when we come back.